income tax or what you could do. Well, if you itemize expenses for your federal income tax, then you could deduct property tax, and thereby you could generate some savings of this increase in your property tax. And how you figure that out is it would depend on what income tax bracket you were in, too. But if you have to take the standard deduction, or if you do take the standard deduction when you figure out your federal income tax, then you would not be able to do this, and you wouldn't be able to get any kind of a break on your federal income tax for this increase in your property tax.
Thanks, Beth. If we could maybe turn now to Chair of the Finance Committee, Carol Grimm. Carol, if you could just tell us why the town needs this money. Page 8, if you're here.
Page 8, which is the revenue page. The first category that Beth talked about was the property taxes. And that actually makes up 62% of our revenue. So that 62% of our revenue can only go up by 2.5% per year. And within this property tax, there is very little commercial and industrial base. I believe the numbers are around 90 to 92% are from residential homes. And as you may know, we do not charge a differential between residential and commercial and industrial. They pay the same rate as we do as property owners. As you can see, that's a significant portion of the revenue. The local revenues, which is made up of your speeding tickets, your parking tickets, excise tax on a new vehicle and old vehicles, that's a fairly small percentage of our total revenue and not something that we really can control. The other big category is state aid, and our state aid now is up to 21% of our revenue. And over the last 7 years, this number has grown significantly to our benefit. Unfortunately, all the signals from the State House are that this number is going to level off. And we have our fingers crossed that it doesn't decline, because it would hurt us significantly. And the last category, like local revenues, is small. It's about 9%. And actually the biggest, other than what we get from the $1.5 million there, almost $1.6 million that we get from the light department, the rest of that is really made up of what we spend in any given year from our free cash and from our sale of real estate funds, which are funds that we've set aside as we've sold property around town, Bear Hill, for instance, and what's in the old Pearl Street School. That money has been set aside to fund the capital plan. So as you can see, the biggest portion is our residential tax that only goes up 2.5% a year. And then state aid is an unknown, and at this point, we don't expect it to grow dramatically. So the bind that we end up in is if you have any category on your expense side that is going up more than 2.5%, it becomes difficult to fund. We've had the luxury over the last 7 years of Chapter 70 money flowing into the town through ed reform, and lottery receipts have been uncapped to the town. That has also increased for us, and that has allowed us to avoid an override situation. When I first joined FinCom in '93, we had just completed the last override, and I was quickly educated on the economics of municipal finance. And unique to Reading is that we are essentially a full growth town. There is not a lot of new growth. We average between 200 and 300,000 a year in additional new growth compared to our neighbors in North Reading, which we envy greatly. They have about $1 million a year in new growth that goes to fund a lot of things around town. But we're a full growth town that is limited by 2.5. And when state aid increases dry up, then you're really stuck. As an example, on the expense side, our debt service is going up 5.6% next year. That's something we have to fund, 5.6%. by law. Special ed is going up almost 17% next year. That's something by law we have to fund. And then 78% of the school budget is salaries. 72% of the town budget is salaries. It's all people expense. This is really a service business. And to the extent that the salary increases are over 2.5%, we're in a bind. Most of the 14 union contracts in town were settled last year. The teachers' contracts were at about 3.5, and I think it's comparable for police and fire. In the budget projected for next year, you will see the salary for existing people is about 4.2%, which is the union contract plus any steps and performance increases. We also, for non-union people on the municipal side, do what we call a pay and class study every 2 years. And our goal is to survey surrounding towns for what they pay for a particular position. And Reading, in its frugal way, targets to be at, hopefully, the middle. And in some categories last year, unfortunately, we found we were way off the mark. We weren't even near the middle. So some of our positions are in a catch-up mode. I'm trying to think of other things that are out of the 2.5 range. The other large category is building maintenance. And that's a category that we've really tried to focus on. We had Pete Marwick, our outside auditors and consultants, do a study and give us some guidelines on where we should be. And we're working towards that goal of fully staffing at the levels that they recommend. And that's one of the reasons that you see the building maintenance category well above the 2.5%. But that's what gets us in a bind.
Now, Carol, is that your final answer? Sure.
I just want to take this moment because I recognize now we have a quorum, and I'd like to call the school committee to order.
And if we could move now to certainly recognizing the role that town meeting will ultimately play, if we could maybe have a brief presentation from the town manager and the school superintendent about what are the potential cuts that we may see if there is no override.
The chart that you have on the overhead is the same information that's in the chart in your packet on page 10. It's just organized a little bit different by major category. And understand that this has not been voted by the Board of Selectmen or the Finance Committee, but this is a result of work that we've done with department heads, where we said if we had to make reductions, if a Prop 2.5 override was not successful and had to make reductions at a certain level, what would you do? What would you suggest? There were 3 guiding principles that I used in terms of going through that kind of list and determining where my recommendations would probably be. The first is to do things that would have the least negative impact on service delivery. If an override is not successful, nobody is out to penalize anybody and say, well, if you all vote for the override, then we're going to do such and such. So we want to maintain service delivery as strong as we can. The second is to have the least negative impact on personnel of the town. We have, in the town side, 200 very dedicated employees providing a whole range of services to you. The same is true in the school department with a couple more employees than we have. And certainly it's in nobody's interest to do anything if we can avoid it would have a negative impact. The third item is really a little bit unique, and that is to retain the ability to move the town forward in terms of investment initiatives. The major investment initiatives that we're working on right now is still the closure and sale of the landfill. Fully developed, that could generate $1.5 billion annually in tax revenue to the town. Obviously, we want to retain our capability as a municipal government to move that process forward and get it done. The other major one that we're working on right now is Addison Wesley is interested in redeveloping their property. They made a presentation to the Planning Commission, I believe it was last week. And again, there is a potential for a redeveloped site generating another $1.5 million in revenue per year. So, we don't want to gut our ability to manage those processes and move those processes forward. We broke down in the slide in front of you several possibilities. One option is to implement a pay-as-you-throw trash fee. We've had a trash fee in the past. It was not a pay-as-you-throw fee. It was basically a flat across-the-board fee. The Board of Selectmen would have to determine whether or not to do that. They have not determined whether or not they would. If they did, that could generate about $500,000, which would be the cost of rubbish disposal, the cost of incineration of it, basically. There's several capital items, and if you look on the list, you'll see that they're all defer. There are no capital items in our project that we will not be doing, or there probably aren't. There may be one or two, but certainly not very many. So by deferring them, you're just putting it off to a later date. The more you put off to a later date, the more problematic it becomes at a later date. There are 4 projects there that we've talked about. I won't go into them in any detail, but they total about $190,000. The next block is personnel, the kind of reductions you'd make. Some of these don't look like personnel because we're talking about reducing library hours, for example, as part of that. Library hours is personnel. That's what keeps the library open, obviously. The kinds of things we're talking about here is reducing a senior tax work program, eliminating zoning enforcement, shifting some positions to revolving funds, which is going to have an effect, for example, of raising recreation fees in town. You'll see some comments about reducing police officers, for example, through attrition. We do have some vacancies or expected vacancies during the next several months. Attrition means that the position is vacant and you're not laying anybody off. But in order to get to the numbers we're talking about, you are talking about some layoffs, particularly 1 police officer, 1 firefighter, and 1 public works employee. And then the last block of it is the expenditures. And they're fairly minor things. The largest one is things like deferring the acquisition of a police vehicle. We've been there. We've tried to replace less than 3 vehicles a year. It always winds up costing us more in maintenance, and we had to replace 4 the following year in order to make up for that. So it's sort of penny wise and pound foolish from our experience, and we have had experience in that. So if you look at the total reductions here, that makes up a significant portion of the total reductions that we look at making. It's about 36% total, and the superintendent will talk about the remainder of it. The other thing I'd just like to say at this point is that if you look at a history, and we went back and took a 10-year look at what's happened in our budgets and what's happened in the personnel, and on the municipal side, we had 197 employees in the year 1990, 197 employees. We have 205 employees now. All of the growth in employment has been in the public safety area, which is through the budget process and priority setting processes, a priority for the community. If you look at the expenses and you look over 10 years, we have departments that have increased at half the level of CPI over the last 10 years. Public Works Department is one. 17% increase, actually it's a little bit more than half, 17% increase over 10 years, and the CPI has increased 28%. Where the increases have been over that period are primarily in 2 areas. One is in capital investment in the community. That's the streets, the roads, the buildings, the parks, all of the things that we have as a community, that we use as a community in various ways. The other area has been in education, and the superintendent will talk a little bit about that, but in the area of education, during that time, we've had something called education reform, and we've had significantly additional revenues given to us by the state to increase our expenditures on education. So what has been happening over those 10 years in all areas is we've been investing in the community, heaviest in the areas that the community we feel wants to be invested in, which is public safety, education, and a capital plan of the community. I'm going to turn it over to the superintendent now, and he can tell you a little bit about the schools.
Thank you, Peter. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you who are here tonight for coming out. We appreciate your audience and the ability to try to explain the problem as we see it. People ask why the school department needs an 8.5%, 8.25% increase. There are 3 major factors that play into that. One, we see an enrollment of about 50 to 100 students each year increase over the last several years. Next year, we're anticipating an increase of somewhere between 70 and 75 new students. What's contributing to that, aside from the increase in births, is that this past year we changed our kindergarten cutoff date, and so we only have 7 kindergarten teachers, and we anticipate going to 9. This past year we only had 8 months of kindergarten enrollment because of a date change. The second item that plays into our problem with an increase is special education. Massachusetts is one of the few states in the United States that does not use 94-142, which is the federal law on providing services to students who are disabled or handicapped. Massachusetts has a much tougher law, which is called Chapter 766. This law, in fact, puts the parent and the school system on even footing and provides the parent with the ability to make sure that their child is receiving services equal to any other student in the school system. To that end, we have seen a major increase in that area. The school department does not have a great deal of appeal. The parent can go to mediation, the school department can go to mediation with the State Department of Education, but that's very difficult, and we seldom win in those cases. The third area is a thing called ed reform. In 1993, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts passed a law called ed reform. Part of that law required school systems, or suggested to school systems, that they make major changes in their curriculum. They also told us where students should learn certain items. And you may have been reading in the paper in the last few weeks, the state is talking about making adjustments in mathematics, and they're also talking no longer about testing in just 4th, 8th, and 10th, but spreading the test out across all grades between grades 4 and 10. Those 3 items probably contribute somewhere between 4 and 5% increase in our school department budget. All 3 of those items are not necessarily mandated, as the special ed is, but to keep Reading children competitive with other towns and communities, we need to do these things. The other thing which is seldom mentioned is that in 1990, 91, and 92, the school department saw less than 0 increases in 3 consecutive years. Those were through some very difficult times. The town also saw reductions, and it's taken 8, hope to be 9 years to recover from that, incrementally moving the system back in place. What we have is a list which has been administratively generated. Similar to the town, our list is a recommendation to the school committee. The school committee has never had an opportunity since this list has come out to sit down and discuss each of the items. These are recommendations, and the list is $1.125 million, which we think exceeds what would happen if the school department, if the school department saw a reduction in services because the override did not pass. We always give the school committee a menu. We always give them a choice. And if the override is unsuccessful, the administrators will be meeting late next week to prioritize the list. And it probably as early as a week from Monday, the school committee will meet to begin to look at that. What I'd like to do is just take a moment to go through the list very quickly. These are not all the items. If you have a copy of the budget on the following pages, you'll see the account numbers, the pages, what have you. But I've taken the opportunity to the elected officials to provide a list of those items which I think highlight. Again, I need to tell you, these are not approved by the Reading School Committee, who ultimately has the final say. These are suggestions that have been generated since December by the principals, directors, and the associate superintendent and myself, and recommendations. Lastly, before I go through the list, I'd like to point out that I can't get into how reductions were made in prior years under similar circumstances, but I can tell you it's the philosophy of the administration then when reductions need to be made that we don't target one particular area, but attempt to do it across the board. It's important to note that this particular recommendation that's been brought to the school committee is working under the premise that if an override is unsuccessful this year, that there would be an attempt next year to have an override, and that a number of the services that would be reduced from here could be brought back, and that the school system would experience the minimal amount of impact with 1 year having to reduce. Some of the things are, we presently have 2 school psychologists at the Parker and 1.5 at the Coolidge. Parker is 125 more students than Coolidge. We would reduce each school psychologist by a half. There's a recommendation for, one of the things we would do is recommend to the school committee that we not cover the out-of-district tuition and transportation in the budget. Over this year, the school committee took that out of the budget, and we'll be going back to town meeting in the spring asking for the town to cover those unanticipated. What we would do is what we did this year, which is to only budget for students that we know in providing special ed services and transportation. We're recommending another nurse, which would now provide full-time nursing services within the schools, all schools. Presently, we have about an 80% coverage in the schools, and each of the schools have about a 15 to 20% no coverage of nurse, but they have beepers and they're contacted. Given the number of prescriptions that are being administered, the number of severe cases, and we have some critical care issues within the school department, we believe a full-time nurse is imperative. This budget, or these lists that I put out, calls for the elimination of freshman sports across the board, both girls and boys. This would bring about a $11,000 savings on coaching salary, about $4,000 on transportation, a couple $1,000s on officials, and what it would require is freshmen would be greatly limited, and only freshmen who were able to make the junior varsity would participate. It calls for no new teaching positions. 1.5 new teaching positions at the high school are being requested. The initial request was over 13 teachers, and I put in the budget and the school committee approved 1.5. I can't tell you exactly where they're going to be because we haven't done sign-ups for next year, but what I can tell you is that over the last 4 years, the high school principal has probably requested somewhere between 15 and 18 teachers, and we've provided him with about 5. 4.5 teachers are being requested at the elementary school for increased enrollment. And what would happen would be, under this recommendation, there would be no new elementary teachers. This would mean that we would take teachers out of the 4th and 5th grade and move them into the primary grades of kindergarten, 1st and 2nd, to keep class sizes there as close as we can to mid and lower 20s, and it would move a number of the 4th and 5th grade classes into the upper 20s. It would call for a major reduction in curriculum initiatives. Starting last year, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts started testing students in social studies. The social studies curriculum is a major change from the curriculums that most towns in Massachusetts have been using across the board to K-12. This past year, the Commonwealth tested to 8th grade students in a practice test. It was our plan to move forward with beginning the change in 4th, 8th, and 10th curriculum in social studies. This budget reduction would eliminate all social studies improvements until the following year, which would be the mandated year. Again, it was a proactive approach. It would call for a reduction of a high school reading teacher. Presently, we have foreign language 2 days a week out of a 6-day cycle. We wanted to go to 3. This would call for the elimination of that 6th grade program. It would call for the reduction of the director of technology, the reduction of 3 new regular education assistants, return 3 instructional specialists to the classroom. We presently have 6. We have a K-5 elementary math, science, language arts, social studies, and we have 2 at the middle school, 1 doing math and science and the other doing language arts and social studies. This would return the 3 who are Reading teachers back to the classroom and only provide us with 3 instructional specialists. These people are the primary people moving curriculum forward. It would call for the a reduction of a high school department head for special education. In the area of maintenance, we've tried to be as gentle as possible. We've placed maintenance at very high. If you go through our budget, you will see that maintenance probably took the smallest amount of reductions. It calls for no reductions in individuals who do cleanings in any of the buildings, the 14 town buildings, either the schools or the town. Presently, we have a vacancy for a plumber. That position has not been filled, and we would not fill it next year. We presently have 2 electricians, and it would call for us to reduce to 1 electrician. The one thing we have to move forward with, because if we don't, I think we'll be in serious trouble, is many of you know that our MCAS scores have been very positive. Our elementary, middle, and high school have been rated by the Boston Globe to be some of the better school districts and schools in Massachusetts. The one area that we have consistently in the last 2 years fallen down is the area of elementary language arts. So this budget would, even with the reduction, move forward with the language arts program. Again, I need to remind you that these reductions are only a recommendation and go a bit farther than I think we'd have to, but it's something that the school committee would have to prioritize and then get back to the administration how they want to move forward. Thank you.
We've got one last question amongst us, and then we'll turn it over to all of you. Beth, if you could just talk to us about a little bit about the permanence of the override and what effect it has going forward.
Yes, Matt. The question about the permanence of the override is an issue that I think we need to be very clear about. There are 3 different types of overrides under Proposition 2.5. There's the general override, of which this is a general override, and then there are capital exclusions and debt exclusions. But the general override has specific rules connected with it, and it works in this way. The $2.5 million that we mentioned that's the subject of this override, if it were passed, would become a part of the tax levy base. And I think we saw on the charts that in fiscal 2000 is about $30 million. So the way that would work for 2001, which is what the next fiscal year, which is when this $2.5 million would become effective if it passed. The way it would work is that you have your $30 million in fiscal 2000, and then normally you would go up 2.5% of the $30 million. That's what's allowed under Proposition 2.5 in every normal year. And then also the legislature allowed an amendment to Prop 2.5 so that you could also increase for the new growth that you have in town, and that would be the new growth in valuations that didn't go up for valuations but was actual new construction or new growth. And usually in Reading, that's about $1 million in round numbers. So you'd have your $30 million in fiscal 2000, and normally you would go up $1 million, or in fiscal 2001, you'd have a tax levy base that you could levy on your properties of about $31 million. Well, if this Proposition 2.5 passed, the $2.5 million, then that tax levy base would go to about $33.5 million, or it would be an extra $2.5 million. So that would then be the base going forward for 2002. And then in 2002, presumably there wouldn't be another override for a general override, and then you would go back to going to 2.5% of your base plus your new growth. So the one-time $2.5 million would then stay in the base as a permanent amount in that base. It would increase. And then after that, it would be 2.5% on the base, which would include the $2.5 million. So I would hope that that would be clear. With debt exclusion and capital exclusion overrides, those are for specific projects, which when the project is completed or when it's paid for, then that amount in the base goes away. But with these general overrides, it stays in the base.
Thanks, Beth. All right, let's open it up. If we could just, I would just ask if everybody, if they have a question, if they could go to a microphone and speak into the microphone so that people at home can hear as well as everybody here in the auditorium. And also, if you could just please state your name and your address before your question, and precinct if you know it. Actually, address would be fine. Questions? Ms. Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Excuse me, Mr. Nestor. I'm used to speaking at town meeting. Precinct 8 for 34 years. Just a few comments. The building...
Do you have a question?
No, I'd just like to make a few comments on the statements that have been made, if that's acceptable to you.
Briefly, if you could.
Okay. I always try to be brief. Building maintenance, we've talked about. That was pledged in the 1993 override. It never came forth. George is shaking his head no, but the town report says yes. We're talking about layoffs. Town meeting is the only one that has the ability to fund. It is up to the town manager thereafter to make whatever cuts. As a town meeting member, I would not cut any police or fire department. I would suggest positions, however, perhaps as assistant town manager, the planner, which by the way was temporary on a grant, and the zoning enforcement officer, and then go from there. Another point brought up by the Department of Revenue. Municipal revenues have increased by 137%. Inflation has increased by 107%. That's adjusted since the first year of Proposition 2.5 in 1981. And we have also privatized many of the services that were in the general fund at that time. Sewer and water was subsidized by the general fund at that time. It is now separate. Cemetery is now separate. That was funded separately. We have talked about the landfill. Well, the landfill has been around in negotiations since 1961, so I don't think there's any big hurry on that one. We'll probably end up capping it. And that basically is my sense. Carol said that on many of our fund revenues, on our payment to people, we are frugal. I think we should be frugal on our taxes. Thank you.
Anybody have a question they'd like to ask?
Francis A. Hagan, 15 Sandra Lane. I notice there is no mention of the proposed elementary school amount in the budget, mentioned anywhere. Can somebody explain that?
We could have Pete or the superintendent.
Exactly, you mean the cost of the new elementary school?
True.
Well, the cost of the new elementary school would be included in the capital plan. And in the capital plan, the costs over the first couple of years are very minimal for the school. I mean, the school will go out for bonding for architectural services in the first year and then bonding in the subsequent years. Mm-hmm. And those amounts would be found in the capital plan. Peter, if you have that and could address that.
Carol could maybe address it as well as Chair.
When we put the capital plan together, there is only about $42,000 in interest expense in that debt service line of our list of expenses that represents the new school.
Are you saying that under this proposition override proposal, that's the cost of that school is not a consideration?
That's correct.
If it's all right, I have a few questions regarding that procedure that's being followed on that school.
If it relates to the finances, we're happy to take it.
It's a finance,
Sure.
Yes,
Go ahead.
absolutely. I'm a proponent of schools. I sat on the school building construction committee for the Killam and this building approximately 8 years, back in 1967 on. And the procedures being conducted now financially are quite different than what we did. We actually retained an architect initially, got final plans, put the job out to bid, the Killam School I'm talking about, put the thing out to bid, and we received low bids, and when we went to town meeting, we knew how much the school was going to cost right to the penny because we had a low bidder. Now, I'm not sure, and somebody has to explain to me, for my edification, number one, are the plans 100% complete? Of all of the authorities in town signed off, police department, fire department, the bus drivers, these people that are going to have to use that site. And actually, that site was considered by my committee in 1960, well, not actually my committee, but a site committee preceding my committee, and was rejected. There were 3 town-owned properties, and at that time, this particular site was owned by 2 old ladies, I believe, one of which wanted to sell and one didn't. But nevertheless, ultimately there was a special town meeting, which I don't have the results, where I think Charlie Chisholm was the chairman of that site committee. And I don't know the results of what he proposed, which included borings, test site borings, determination if the site was suitable for construction, and access, fire department, police department, etc. So there's a little bit of things that are buffaloing me at the moment, and I'd like to see the answers. I mean, as I say, I'm all for schools, but this particular thing, I don't. If this is not part of the override cost, is there going to be another override to take care of the schools?
Thank you for your question. Those 2 fine women were the Piper sisters, and they worked as cafeteria workers in the schools for a great number of years. As a matter of fact, I think both turned out to be cafeteria managers. We have a request from our Director of Cafeteria Services to consider their names for that building. I can't speak to 1961, or when those schools were built, or the regulations that existed.
No, 67.
67. What I can tell you is that when I came to Reading in '95, the date for submission was always June 1st. That was the deadline. 2 years ago, school building assistants moved that up because they were being inundated last minute. And today was the first filing date, and we successfully filed our papers. Given the time limits that the state has established, the procedure that we've used on the Coolidge Middle School, I believe on the Parker, and again on this is that the town school building committee, which I think was formed in 1988, has jurisdiction on reviewing, hiring an architect to do a feasibility study. Once a feasibility study is done, an estimate of the project is put forth. Both on the Parker, the Coolidge, and on these 2 schools, those estimates are the amount the town has voted on, and that's what goes out to bid, so that the general contractors have to meet the amount that the town has put forward. And again, it's a cost estimate from the architect. Those organizations that you mentioned, fire, police, the conservation administrator, the town planner, have all participated in 2 meetings with the town manager and myself, with the architect to review. And some of the changes that we've made in the last 2 to 3 weeks have been a result of the input that we received from fire, police, and what have you. One of the questions that was raised on Monday night was, how firm do the plans have to be on submission of today and June 1st? We have to submit to today architectural only to the point of a schematic, what's referred to as programmatic, which is a listing of the programs that would be in the building, and a very tentative site plan. Today, borings were done, and the process was started to obtain those borings. By June 1st, we will be submitting something much more comprehensive, which would also contain runoff for conservation and those kind of things. And I'm not sure if those things were affected in 1967. But the law is much tougher now on where we can go and how we can go and buffers and things of that sort. The procedure we're using is the same procedure as we used on the Coolidge, the Parker, And it's been the way that the school department has proceeded. It also is hindered by the dates that we have to submit by.
Well, once again, I get back to the financial issue. Regardless of what the requirements for the state are, the consideration is for the taxpayers in Reading. And the procedure that, as I repeat, used in the Killam School is that the plans were 100%. The job was put out to bid, so we knew exactly when we went to town meeting, to the penny pretty much, what the school was going to cost.
Probably the major reason why we didn't do that is we would have to exert somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000 to get architectural drawings that would bring it to the level you're talking about. And it's been the practice, at least prior to me coming to Reading, to get a feasibility study and not to commit the town to $500,000 in architectural studies that very well may not move forward. As you know, last year, the town did not vote to move the new project forward, and if we had made that $500,000 investment and this did not pass, that would have been money that was non-reimbursable.
But how can we proceed with building a school that you don't know if it's going to work?
Well, what I can tell you is there's 11.6 acres up there, and the architect said there's no question that we can build a school for your needs up there. And we have every confidence to believe that we can do that, and hopefully the borings and everything else. What it's really coming down to now is where the school's going to be on the property, not whether we can build one. SBAB has visited the site, walked the site, and has approved the site as a site acceptable for a school.
The other thing I would just like, for my own edification, is to find out precisely what happened when Charlie Chisholm's site committee suggested and received some money, which was $1,000, by the way. Times have changed. The Killam School architectural plans, we appropriate $65,000. So times have changed. I appreciate that. But the fact remains is that I'm not 100% convinced that that site is a desirable site for the school. Thank you.
Gentlemen, you had a couple questions, financial questions, that I might want to try to address. One of the questions, as I understood it, was whether or not the new school would require an override. And the answer to that is no. The funding mechanism for the new school consists of two sources. As most of you know, approximately 2/3 of it will come from the state. The other 1/3, which comes from the town, is funded, what we call, out of the capital plan. Every year, out of the total revenues that the town has available to it to spend, a small portion of that, say about 6.5% or so, perhaps Carol or Peter could talk to the capital plan a little more specificity, but a small portion of that is used to fund capital projects from the capital plan. The capital plan is a document the town has been using for approximately 10 years. It's a prospective-looking document that says, let's take a 10-year snapshot of the town's capital needs, the major expenses like buildings and automobiles and some of the big-ticket items that communities typically find difficult to pay for because of their large costs. Reading is one of the few towns in the Commonwealth that uses that as a planning tool to anticipate future needs and to plan for that, and then to fund it with that small portion of what would otherwise be the operating revenues, put that into the capital plan to fund these projects. And I think if you compare Reading to other communities, you will realize that every single capital project that has been done in this town has been done in that manner. There hasn't been a single override for any capital projects in the town of Reading. I'm not sure, but I know that there are very few other communities that have that track record. And I think that's a credit to the community as a whole for what at the time was very forward-thinking in terms of how to fiscally plan for these large ticket items. And I think the community has benefited enormously from that. Not a single override for these big projects. This particular project here, the new school, will not require an override because of what I just described. So for those who might be thinking that there's this big project out there that will require an override next year to fund, the answer is no. Now, I hope that help it explains. Sure. Okay. Well, I don't know if there needs to be more explanation of how the capital plan works, but Peter or somebody else can probably address that if there is.
Are there any other questions? Okay, Paula.
Paula Perry, Precinct 1, 40 Beaver Road. I know, and a lot of town people see this, we've been seeing big increases on the school side, but as Dr. Haratunian went through, we're seeing a lot of that because of state mandates on the special ed side and other initiatives that the state has put forward. I did want to know how we historically and how we measure up against other communities in the state with how we spend our money.
Several statistics that may be of interest. In 1997, Reading had the 37th highest average property tax bill in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So if you looked at the average, and the average is different for every community, obviously, but if you looked at that, Reading was 37th from the top. We're currently 47th from the top in the most recent information that we have. That doesn't mean that we reduced our property taxes. That means that other communities increased their property taxes more. Very interestingly, for the average home, the difference between number 37 and number 47 now is almost to the dollar the amount of the Prop 2.5 override impact on the average home. We've looked at some statistics for communities around us, not picking the high-priced communities, but picking Stoneham, Wakefield, Linfield, North Reading, North Andover, Tewksbury, Billerica, Wilmington. Communities around us that we compare ourselves to, that we're relatively comparable to. They're in our neighborhood, and in every single one of those, for those communities, in every single category of expenditure, the town of Reading is below the average. Per capita spending, average for those communities for all municipal services, school, fire, police, all of that, is about $1,800 per year. That's per capita expenditures. In Reading, it's about $1,650 per year. If you look at fire, police, library, general government, public works, all of those were considerably below the average of those communities that are very comparable communities to us. What does that mean? Reading's always been, I'm told a nice word for it is very frugal. I think we are a frugal community. I think we work very hard to deliver services for the lowest possible dollar. What that tells me is, comparing ourselves to those other communities, just statistically, that we are in fact doing that. The school figures, the superintendent may be able to speak to. I know what the state average is, and the average for those communities. Our per pupil expenditure is considerably below those. Our measures, we're using MCAS, I guess, these days for the measure of success. Our measure of success, our MCAS scores are above the average.
In fiscal year 1995, the Reading as a school system was approximately $632 below the state average on per pupil spending. The latest number that came out, which is 1998, has it $914. And people would say, with 8% increases, how is the school system falling that far behind? The three things that I talked about: enrollment, special ed, and state mandates. What it means is other communities are putting more per dollar per town forward than we are at a much faster rate. So in 1995, we were about $632 below the per pupil on the state average. If you take the difference and you multiply it out, you're talking about millions and millions and millions of dollars. In the case of the MCAS, there were approximately 32 school systems that finished at our level or higher, which I believe was 23rd in the state. There were several that had the same score, and that's why. There were only 5 school systems of those 32 odd school systems that were spending less money per pupil than Reading, who scored in the range that we did. I think it's a tribute to the staff in the school district. We have one of the lowest averages of spending for administration. Our administrative budget is very low in comparable towns. I think a lot has to do with the relationship that we have with the town in utilizing the town finance director and the town accountant and saving the town duplication of a $400,000 business manager with secretaries, accountants, and what have you. It does put an extra burden on us, but I think it's a better way to go.
Could I address that just a little bit also? Not only does the Reading school system, let me just focus on that, spend, as you heard the superintendent indicate, close to $1,000 per pupil, less than the state average. But we also spend about that much less compared to other communities that we think are either socioeconomically very similar to Reading, or for other communities in the Middlesex League, ones that live around us and who our sports teams play with, and probably most of our friends live in the Middlesex community. That $1,000 per student, roughly that delta that we spend less on a per pupil average of a little over $5,000 means that Reading spends about 80% of what other communities like us spend on education per student. And that roughly $1,000 difference with over 4,000 kids in the school system is over $4 million a year that we spend less on education in Reading than do other comparable communities. That $4 million on a $26 million budget is a huge percentage. So while I think we do, as a town, spend our money wisely, there's also a point at which if you don't spend money, you don't get the services. And ultimately, we have to decide whether we want these services or not.
Hi, Donna Bollier, Belmont Street, Precinct 2. I have two questions. The first in regards to schools. In particular, it came to my attention that at the kindergarten information meeting last night that it was mentioned that if the override does not go through, the space available at Coolidge for the overflow from Birch Meadow would not be able to be utilized, and the children would be districted over to Barrows, I'm assuming. I don't really know that. And my question is, I don't understand what the effect is. If you have the space available and you have the staff, I don't understand the point in that.
I received a couple calls tonight about that. What we are doing is that if we're not increasing our professional staff at the elementary and we have the same number, then we have room in the elementary schools. It had always been our hope, even this coming year, that we would be able to find enough space in the elementary schools. So the thinking of the principals, the 4 elementary principals, and myself is that if we're not increasing the staff, and that's the major reason why we were moving them to Coolidge, then we would keep the kindergarten children in the elementary school and do what we've done the last 10, 15 years, which is to bus them. I spoke to one individual this evening and said that's completely up for discussion. Obviously, if the Birch Meadow parents are more comfortable with the children being at Coolidge than going over to Barrows, that's something that we certainly didn't expect, but we'd be happy to discuss it.
Well, I would think from a financial point that instead of taking, my child is not in Birch Meadows, so I don't know the fine details, but if you have to bus kids over, there's an expense that you don't necessarily have to make, and if we're looking to save the town and you could use that money elsewhere to benefit other people.
If we bring the children over to the Coolidge, we're going to have to hire additional staff, and that's in the budget, because an educational assistant, an extra one. The bathrooms are not located in the classrooms. The classrooms are smaller than the spaces that would be used over at Barrows, and I'd also have to purchase books so that I would have another collection of big books and elementary reading materials and what have you. What I'd have to do is sit down and cost out the cost between a bus, an ed assistant, and the materials. But I was surprised because we traditionally have bused our students when there's space in the elementary schools to the elementary schools. I had no idea that kindergarten parents were as happy as it turned out that they were going to have Birch Meadow students going to the Coolidge Middle School. So that is not something that's closed, and we are certainly open and willing to discuss that.
Okay, thank you.
One thing I'd like to add is recommendations are just recommendations. If this did not pass, we would, hold another series of meetings and review these recommendations, and there would necessarily be changes. And changes would be made based on recommendations of the people in the surrounding area. Certainly, if there was an overwhelming number of parents of those kindergartners, we might look at the budget differently. That doesn't mean we would, but I'm just saying these are not recommendations that are etched in stone. These are just a proposal of the administration to show the extent of what the cuts might have to be if revenue wasn't forthcoming.
Super, thank you. And the second question is in regard to the landfill. I'm concerned that I understand that it has to be capped by November, and if my understanding is that we don't have a solid buyer yet, and so if we don't have a buyer and it needs to be capped by November, how is that going to be funded, and is that included in this override or in your regular budget?
The cost of closure of a landfill for just closure purposes, not for future development, but just closure, is estimated to be about $3.5 to $4 million. It is not included in the capital plan, and it is not included in the budget. The way that would be funded if the town had to do it would be to go out and bond for it. You'd probably sell a 10-year bond or 20-year bond, whatever the appropriate terminology or term of it would be, and you would finance that over time. There would be no effect of that in the FY 2001 budget because you wouldn't have to bond for that until 2001, but the first payment would come due in 2002, and that is not included in these projections. We're working hard and optimistic that we will in fact have a buyer for the landfill who will close the landfill. We will probably have to get an extension from the DEP of our closure date, and we're prepared to do that once we have another buyer signed up for it, basically.
Is that something that they readily do? They grant you extensions?
Grant extensions. DEP has been very helpful with us on this project. This is a somewhat unique project in the Commonwealth. When we entered into the consent order with them for closure, their terminology was something to the effect, it's not really a problem, it's not an environmental problem, but everybody's got to close their landfill at some time, so you need to close yours. So it's not like this is a Superfund site or anything like that. It's a relatively benign site. We've tested it to within an inch of its life. Actually, the water quality is just as good off-site below stream as it is upstream. So it's really not a problematic site for DEP. We anticipate they would continue to work with us and grant us extensions as long as we're making progress. If we're not making any progress, I can guarantee you they will not grant us any extensions.
On a personal note, in regards to the landfill, based on the fact that 92% of the tax revenue comes from residential, I would hope that maybe we can do something more than have possible apartments there and maybe get something more retail in there to take some of the pressure off of the residents in the town. And I know that there's more involved than just me saying that, but that's my hope. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, sir. Yeah.
I'm Jeff Struble. I live at Tower Road, and that's in Precinct 7. I guess, Peter, I'd like to throw this one at you, but maybe, Beth, you'd like to catch it as well. As I understand it, I'm listening to you and being in town meeting and going through the budgets every year. The lion's share of the budget is personnel expenses. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Salaries, entitlements, benefits, so forth and so on. And if I also understand what you've said tonight and what I've seen over the years, the increases in personnel expenses exceeds 2.5% pretty regularly. Is that a fair statement?
I would say so. I mean, I can tell you that our union settlements for the town are basically 2.5%, a little bit more than 2.5% per year for the 3 years of the existing contract.
Okay.
So it's close, but probably a little bit over.
Well, then my question is this: I'm looking beyond fiscal year 2002 and going forward some distance. If the majority of the expenses in the budget are going to be increasing more than 2.5%, or seem to be doing that, does that mean that further on down the road, we're going to be seeing, more catch-up overrides, which is what I think this really is. Are we going to be seeing more layoffs, or are we going to be seeing both? Just because of the nature of the beast, because of the structure of our finances. Is that may not be a fair question, but I'm looking beyond fiscal year 2002, and will we be back here again every so often? So have you looked forward, projected forward your increases based on your revenue?
It's a very valid question, and we try as a local government to look forward as much as we can. But sometimes, because of circumstances beyond our control, forward is like next fiscal year if we're lucky. Some of us in this room remember in 1990, I think it was 1990, we went forward at annual town meeting with a budget, and in August the cherry sheet came out, which is a state aid funding, and the governor impounded over $1 million of state aid to the town of Reading and other cities and towns as well. So we thought we had planned it well. We thought we knew what we were getting. We knew what the legislature had provided for, but the governor impounded it. Eventually that money was released, but meanwhile, that was the beginning of cutback government in Reading for the early 90s. And the superintendent referenced 3 years of less, of actually reductions in actual budgets, not increases in budgets. We're pretty clear over the next 2 years, unless something catastrophic happens one way or the other. If something catastrophic happens that we get a lot more money, what we've talked about is this is still the budget we'll live with, and we'll bank the money. We won't either go for the full override amount, we won't utilize it all, or we'll save free cash for a rainy day, or whatever it might be. Our personnel costs on the town side, given what's happening in the economy today, are about as constrained as they're going to be. If you look at what's happening in the general economy, 2.5% salary increase for employees is a reasonable salary increase. We're not giving people greater increases than we should be. We want to be competitive. Our goal is, as somebody, I think Carol mentioned, even though our expectations are that our people are performing at this level, we pay at this level. We pay in the middle of the pack of comparable communities. And again, we're not going to Andover, Concord, and Lexington for comparability. We're looking at Stone and Wakefield and the communities that I mentioned that are around us. We had an override in 1993. It was successful. We're back in year 2001, 8 years later. Can we survive another 8 years without an override? It depends on a lot of things. If we sell and close the landfill, that's going to be a big help. If Addison Wesley redevelops, that's going to be a big help. If there's changes in special ed law and funding by the state, that would be a big help. There are some initiatives that we're trying to work on, and one of the things we want to make sure that we don't do is gut our ability to work on those initiatives for the long-term benefit of the community. But my expectation is at some point the voters of Reading will be back for Prop 2.5 override for operating purposes. I think everybody's goal is to make that length of time as long as you can possibly make it between overrides.
I just want to talk to Rick's question a little bit, or Jeff's question a little bit too. When the framers of Prop 2.5, Proposition 2.5, put their proposal together, they recognized that communities were not going to be able to live with a 2.5% increase every year, year after year. That was a recognized part of their program, and what they devised was this ballot question system where the municipal officers take the budget question to the electorate, and in effect they become a larger town meeting and put the question to the electorate on a general basis. We feel like we've been very prudent in the number of times we've gone to the electorate to ask their permission to exceed the 2.5 increases. You've heard a number of ways tonight from other folks how we have done things to prudently manage the budget, including the capital budget, and including, I want to go back to a reference that was made earlier to the town planner position being made temporary and being established through a grant. The intention was not for the planner position or any other positions that we began through grants to be temporary. Basically, when you establish a position through a grant like that, whether it be a police officer, which we did through the COPS program, or a planner, you establish those positions by grants so that you can ease into them and phase the salary of those functions in a way that can be accommodated by the Prop 2.5 cap. And I think I would challenge anyone to follow the town planner, the assistant town manager, or any of the other positions that were mentioned earlier this evening around during their workday, and see if you think they have any free time on their hands. And I think you'll probably see that these positions, not only do they do their own functions, but in many cases pick up the slack and do clerical type work as well, because that's another area where we've been very frugal. But just to go back to my original point, the town has been well managed, and we've gone to the town, we've gone to the electorate on a very infrequent basis, as Proposition 2.5 has provided for, to ask for an increase over and above 2.5, and in between those times, we've managed the town's finances on a very prudent basis.
Other questions? Yes.
My name's Fred McGrain. I'm 16 Catherine Ave. It's apparent from looking at the budget that approximately 50% of thereabouts is earmarked to the schools. And it looks like over the past 10 years, the budget for the schools has increased dramatically. The question is regarding the new dividends school. I understand roughly 2/3 will be reimbursed by the state for the bricks and mortar. What about the teachers?
Going to use a lifeline and call a friend?
When we presented to school the last 2 years at town meeting, we said repeatedly that the number of staff positions would not increase when those doors opened up dramatically. If we do an incremental, we're looking at approximately 3 elementary teachers every year leading up to 2002 and 2003. The major cost, if you will, when we costed out the new school, was around such things as an additional school nurse, an additional school secretary, a principal, and more custodial because of square footage. What needs to be taken into account is if we didn't open up this 5th school, the 4 existing schools would hit 600 to 700 students and would require an assistant principal at each of those schools with additional. When we costed it out, we were extremely favorable to the 4 school and very embellishing with the 5 school. And I think we came up with the $175,000 difference. So the bottom line is that the state does not regularly reimburse for that. That being qualified, there is a grant that came out this year for a half of a teacher in Reading for a grant to reduce enrollment. It's a little bit like throwing a pebble into the ocean. But if we open the school tomorrow, we would be able to fill most of those classrooms because of the number of classrooms that we need and core facilities such as art and music. And those teachers already exist.
Yeah, I just want to comment on that, because one of the things that's happening with the new school, it's driven primarily by enrollment issues. And as the enrollment increases over the next 2 or 3 years, the positions that would necessarily fill that school need to be filled anyway. You have, for instance, you might have a speech pathologist, a nurse, or a psychologist, and their caseload can only be so high and is dependent on the number of students they service. And if your students go up, you're necessarily going to have to add that position anyway in order to service the students properly. So those people will move over to the new school. So gradually, staff is increasing to meet the needs of a larger student population. And what we will do when the school is completed is move those people and those students into a new facility. So we're not going to just open the doors and staff 14 classrooms, a psychologist, a nurse, and all the other positions that are required. But we'll move people that are already hired to meet the enrollment needs. Go ahead.
One other important point to note, though, is that while the extra cost, if you will, of the new school, which the superintendent suggested was $175, as I recall, the actual delta was about $157,000 when we presented it to town meeting last. Even that cost won't, that's not, you're not going to see that for a couple years until the school actually opens. So it's not in this coming year's budget. It's not in the next coming year's budget. It's several years out there. So it has absolutely no impact right now. As modest as it is, it has absolutely no impact on the town's finances for the next several years. So it's not part of the issue that's generating the need for the override right now.
Other questions? Nate? Oh, I'm sorry, Bob. Excuse me.
Brown, Precinct 6. The statement has been made that one of the reasons for the increase in the school budget is the special education requirement. My question is the amount of coverage that from the state that we get for this. We do get coverage from, we do get money from Chapter 70 and from the lottery. Does this cover the increase? If not, what is being or can be done to reduce the amount of requirements for special education mandated by the state for communities like Reading that has a very low tax base in the commercial area?
Let me try to answer that. One of the things that has been, one of the ideas that has been floated through the legislature is to have the state pick up what I would call the catastrophic effects of the severe cases. Now, we do have cases that can cost upwards to $50,000 plus for various students. And in proposals that have been floated, and these are only proposals, and the legislature has heard these many times, and that they may start to hear a lot of the communities get more and more concerned because of the same issues we're facing here. But in the case that's being discussed, they would pick up something that might be the equivalent of over 2 or 3 times the normal per pupil cost. So if we have a foundation cost of $6,000, we might be required to pick up to $12,000 or maybe up to $18,000 of that student's cost. But over that, the state would reimburse us 70, 80, 90% of the differences. And that's one idea that's being floated. And I think the superintendent can give you some background into a few of the professional organizations that are discussing these types of proposals.
Bob, we're very concerned about this at the superintendent's level and at the school committee level at the state. I belong to a group called the Suburban Coalition 2000, which is primarily made up of superintendents and elected officials in this area who are continually meeting and concerned about the cutting back on Chapter 90 by the state, the cutting back and the impact that special ed budgets have on fixed incomes, retirees, and things like that. What the state has basically done is taken this group of about 600 students and making sure that that group, no matter how much the town spends, those needs are met, and then the remainder of the money is split between the children that are left. Both our state senator and our state representatives are very, very supportive of legislative change. The Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents has put forth a proposal in a new formula for ed reform which needs to be negotiated that Reading or any other community would not pay more than 3 times the per pupil. So we're talking about Reading would not pay for anything beyond $16,000 or $17,000, any student beyond that. Mr. Dahl talked about 50,000. We have significant numbers of students that are closer to $60,000 and $80,000 within the school district, and that's just for tuition. That doesn't include sometimes as much as $20,000 a year for transportation. We're looking at this. There is a strong movement afoot, but I caution people, and I've said this to the school committee and I've said it to the financial forum. Each year of the Commonwealth in the last few years, because of the extra revenues, have taken money that's been at the state level, the excess, if you will, and they've sent it back. Reading, in the end, got very close to what we thought we should have gotten on our cherry sheet a year ago. It came back to us in 2 forms. It came back at the end of June, and then it came back in November. The concern we have is that the state may take that money, and instead of sending it back to us so that we can put it back into our general account and not earmarking it, that the state may now take that money and earmark it for special education, which in some cases is good, but it clearly does not work in a community where town and schools are working closely together. Some people have said to me, what would happen if we just stopped paying these things? The answer is the state, we're required to pay these things. We would lose in litigation heavily. And one of the things that is required is that when the school department does not provide special education services, and we make a claim with the state, and 6 months later the case is resolved, if we lose, we have to provide services for those last 6 months. So if the child would have gotten 5 hours of tutoring, we'd also have to figure in the last 6 months. So we don't get away from not paying. I suspect that under the Massachusetts law with the foundation budget, the town could ultimately hold setting our tax rate, and the town would not be able to tax.
Thank you.
The other piece, I think, of Bob's question is the increase in sped that's in the superintendent's proposed budget, school committee budget, is about $800,000 from FY 2000 to FY 2001. If you look at page 8 and you look at the total increase in intergovernmental revenue, that is the increase in state aid, it's about $900,000. So literally, almost every dime that's coming to us in additional state aid is being spent in one area, in one department of the town.
One of the comments I'd like to make, too, is I don't like to beat on the issue of special ed. The special ed budget increases because we have students that have serious needs. And we try to take care of those needs in a way that's both educationally necessary and fiscally prudent. We do spend less than most of the surrounding communities on a per pupil basis for special ed. But we need to be aware of the fact that these are necessary services. And when we build the budget up, it's built per student up to a level that we're certain will take care financially of the services necessary and required by law. So it's not just that, let's see, every year we've had an 8% increase, let's throw 8% next year. It's built from the bottom up on the number of students and the number of services required. And in the past year, what we did was take out what we call the unanticipated. It's number of students that may move into the district from out of state, for instance, where we might have a serious case that requires that makes a significant financial impact on us. We took that out because it wasn't something that we could necessarily predict. And what happens is, as in previous years, a number of cases moved into the town, large services were provided, and that area of the budget has a significant cost overrun, which was also funded by the state in the late money that came in, which was earmarked for education. But the point I want to make is, when we look at that number, it's a number that's related to children and the services that are necessary. So when the town manager is commenting that the budget is going up, and he is absolutely right, it is going up. And it's going up because we have requirements, students who have needs that we're required to take care of.
Just one last thing, Bob. I just checked the book. The last number, that per pupil that we just talked about, where the average is about 914 below the state average. When you pull out the special ed, Reading is spending more than $1,200 below the state average on each special education student as compared to the state.
And actually, I can confirm the numbers Peter gave you. I did an analysis. In fiscal '94, our Chapter 70 money was $1,780,000. And we're projecting for '01, our Chapter 70 money will be $5,320,000, which is about a $3.5 million increase in Chapter 70 ed reform, state aid for education. In fiscal '94, we spent about $2.5 million on special ed. In fiscal '01, we're projected to spend $6 million on special ed. So it's exactly a $3.5 million increase. So essentially, our Chapter 70 increases have gone towards helping us with our special ed budget.
Other questions? Yes.
My name's Ken Tucci. I live in Precinct 8. As is certainly reasonable in any discussion about an override, you folks are spending a lot of time talking about dollar figures, budget lines, percentages. It all makes sense to do that. But I'd like to ask you for a few minutes to set aside the dollar figures and put a human face on this discussion. I'd like to hear the school department or school committee members and the superintendent talk about how our children will be affected if this override is not passed. You know, how will our children be adversely affected?
Let me start. Let me just start by saying that one of the things that will necessarily happen is that class sizes will rise. And one of the policies the school committee has tried to deal with is tried to reduce the class sizes. It's been an initiative of the school committee, it's been an initiative of the state, and it's certainly been an initiative at the federal government. And people generally tend to recognize that children learn better in smaller classes, and that it is a beneficial thing. Other things that happen, let's face it, one of the initiatives this year that we're trying to put forward is to add a new nurse. I mean, the nurse is based on caseloads. The nurse is based trying to keep one in each school. Whenever a nurse is not in the school and something happens, a student may be slightly injured, maybe more seriously injured, maybe having some type of a medical issue, and has to wait for a trained medical person to arrive from another school. I mean, generally they're kept in contiguous areas, but that's an initiative that we're adding in next year's budget that the superintendent has recommended, and it's only a recommendation. We may not accept that recommendation, but that's the type of thing that I think puts a human face on it. I mean, I have to tell you a story. My son had some type of an injury on the playground, and I get a call from the school, and he's okay. He's in the room, and a nurse will be over in a little while to take a look at him. Now, it wasn't too serious. He got hit in the head, and they were certainly concerned that he was conscious, and he's got a relatively hard head, so that was a good thing. But it could have been an asthmatic reaction, or it could have been an allergy of some sort. It could have been something more severe. So we have a certain group of people in the town that have been very proactive at adding that nurse, and certainly they have a good medical and educational reason for doing so. So when we take that away, that takes something away from the services that we're providing to the students. And in this day and age where there are all kinds of issues in the environment, issues between students, I mean, things like teachers, aides, and nurses are people that put their hands on the situation. They care for the kids, and when we cut them, we cut the services available to them. We know today it's not what things were in '71. It's not what things were in '51. It's a very different world we live in, and we're trying to provide many more services than people ever imagined 20 years ago. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Tim Sherman. Tim, did you want to follow up?
I do. I'm trying to figure out how to get this thing on. A couple other examples which the administration has recommended, and again, let's make it clear, they've recommended this, so this doesn't necessarily mean the school committee will adopt these recommendations, but in nature, I think they give a good indication of the kind of judgments ultimately the school committee will have to make. One of the recommendations is to eliminate the 6th grade foreign language program at the middle schools. Certainly in my tenure on the school committee, one of the most frequently requests on the part of parents is to push foreign language from the high school into the middle school and even down into the elementary schools. We've worked on that long and hard and made what appears to many to be painfully slow progress to first get it into the 8th grade, then to the 7th grade, and we have just trickled it a little bit into the 6th grade this year, and we hope to do a little bit more next year. The recommendation is to eliminate it entirely from the 6th grade. MCAS, as we sit here today, at some point in the future, an undetermined date, says they will test foreign language. We don't know when, and therefore, and we certainly don't know exactly what they're going to do in that regard, but it's hanging out there. And we, assuming that the foreign language test at 10th grade level in order to graduate looks something like the other tests in the other subject areas, we need to have a good comprehensive foreign language program in place, tested and running, with our kids in it, matriculating through it, so that by the time they get to the 10th grade, whenever that's going to be, and have to take that test, they'll be prepared. We're not there yet, and we're not going to get there at the rate we're going if these are the kinds of things that we have to do. Again, maybe we won't make that choice. We'll have to make some other equally difficult choice, but that's an example. Another example is the Director of Technology. That position is being suggested to be eliminated. As with any of the superintendent's recommendations, there are pros and cons. So again, let's not get too excited about any one thing, but that's a key position within the school system. That's the one who provides the overall strategy and objective setting of the technology program. We invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in technology yearly in the purchase of hardware and software. We spend equally as much time, if not actual dollars, in trying to train our staff to use it effectively, both for their own purposes, but as well, and particularly for educational purposes for the kids. That's, I think, a key reduction if we were to go forward with that. There is a recommendation that instructional specialists, which the superintendent discussed a little bit, be reduced. The specific recommendation is to take 3 of the instructional specialists away from their role as such and put them back in the classroom to be regular classroom teachers. The elimination of those 3 roles of instructional specialists, those are the key people who are moving forward the school system's implementation of curriculum modifications to adjust to the ed reform requirements and ultimately the MCAS testing procedures that are in place. We have to move forward with it. One way or another, we've got to deal with it. That's a difficult choice that we might have to make, and it will definitely impact the kids, in future years. Sort of in tandem with that, you see some money being suggested to be reduced for what are called curriculum initiatives. Well, that's what the instructional specialists are helping to develop and shape and move forward. Obviously, if we don't have them doing that, they're not going to need some of these supplies that would achieve that objective of reshaping our curriculum to meet these ed reform requirements, let's say the curriculum frameworks in the state. So I hope that gives a little bit of the flavor of the seriousness of the kinds of issues that ultimately the school committee will have to address. And I just want to make it clear that we haven't discussed any of that as a committee, and probably everybody on the committee will have somewhat different views of what ought to be done to address the shortfall. But it's very difficult to say from this point in time, at this point in time, that if we don't do those recommendations, that there will be other far less painful reductions that we could somehow pluck out of the air and make those reductions instead. I suspect that whatever we do will, at least to large sectors of the community, will seem to be equally painful.
I saw a question over here.
Stephen Cool, Prospect Street, Precinct 6. Peter mentioned that in 1990, Dukakis pulled back $1 million from this community, and I guess, of course, that was a result of the unraveling of his Massachusetts miracle. What's the guarantee that we're going to see the School Building Assistance Bureau actually pony up 2/3 of the cost of the new school? Keeping in mind we have $1.4 billion at least in big dig overruns and tax reduction at the state level probably coming, so on.
I talk to our state senator and I talk to our state reps almost on a weekly basis. If it's not about special ed law changes, it's about SBAB and the issues we're dealing with. I can't guarantee anything. All I can tell you is that every state senator and almost every state representative has a project to go on to the list this year or next year.
Yeah.
And what I can tell you is the word around the legislature is that one of the things that every community is looking at is the SBAB. There was a line in the cherry sheet for Reading that was similar to every town in Massachusetts, and it's called general assistance. And the governor is looking to cut 10%? 10% out of general assistance. And we got cut almost 200,000, 197,000. Again, talking to the legislators, he wanted to use that money for low-income housing and a program. There's not a great deal of support. What I can tell you is that there are two proposals for changes to SBAB on the table. There's the Department of Education proposal, which would have our two projects fully funded at 66%, and anything that gets in for this year would be fine. The governor is looking at a different proposal that would take everything off the board, and every project would be evaluated and given points, and points would turn into reimbursement. I've also been informed that the Senate Pro Tem will be coming out with a plan in the next few weeks, and the Speaker of the House will also be coming out with a plan. But given the rate that the state has been working on the budget, there is very little likelihood from the people we're talking to in my professional organizations that the state is probably going to be able to make any changes to SBAB prior to June 1st. And that's the drop-dead date for projects for this year. What we're being told out of the Department of Education from the Commissioner's Office is any project that's in the SKU for this year and does make it in March 1st and makes it in June 1st will have a high probability of being funded at the rate that's been out there. But to tell you I'm absolutely guaranteed, I can't. I can produce letters from the Department of Education which say, as recently as a month ago, from the head of SBAB, that the project is fundable at 66%, that the land we want to build it on is acceptable by SBAB, and if the project is turned in by June 1st, there's a high probability we're going to be accepted.
But the funding is not just 1 year. It's over several years, and each year the legislature has to vote a new budget. And if they cut the SBAB budget in the second year, we could be left holding the bag.
You have to remember now, what I said, Stephen, is that this isn't a 5-town or 100-town. Virtually every state senator and almost every state representative has a project that needs to be funded. The very people who will decide whether to veto the governor's proposal are the very people who would have to go back to their communities and explain why funding that was promised for the next 20 years is cut off. I can't promise. I can only tell you that given the number of senators and state representatives and the word that I'm getting from our local people, plus the Massachusetts Association of School Committees and the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents, the DOE proposal promise, if you will, has strong backing.
Thank you, Harry.
Could you just comment on, has any project ever not been fully funded once it's made it on the list?
SBAB's been around a long time. This particular legislative act dries up in 2002. And we think that all of the jockeying that's going on right now is to set the platform for the renewal in 2002. So we think the projects for this year and most likely next year are going to be okay. What Pete is referring to is that in the history of SBAB, they have funded every project all the way through, and no project ever in the history of SBAB, and we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, has not been funded in 5 years or less. And in the case of the Parker project, it was funded in 4 years, and we have some real good news. It definitely, our funding on the Coolidge project will be in 4 years, and depending on the cutoff for this budget, Beth and I have looked at it, there's a real possibility that Reading may receive funding on the Coolidge project in 3 years, not 4 and not 5. Again, with the extra money at the state level, it'd be very, very hard for the state to pull that money off the table.
I hear you. We are nonetheless left with the uncertainty.
I can't guarantee you're ever going to see lottery money. I can't guarantee Chapter 70, Chapter 90. It's only as good as any other piece of state aid that we get. And I guess we're 23, 24% state aid. So we hope that it's going to come through. I will tell you this. There is probably a much higher probability that the Chapter 70 formula is going to make a change in the near future than the SBAB.
I have one more question relating to something that was said earlier, not to Harry. One person on the front table called this a bare bones budget, and Peter commented that we have spent frugally as a town over the years. When I look at this page 9, though, I see implement maintenance study, fiscal year 2001, $50,000, fiscal year 2002, $100,000. Now, isn't that something that we're already paying for? We have a town planner, we have a town manager, we have superintendent of school, we have maintenance people in the schools, we have so many people whose job it is to oversee their bit of responsibility in Reading. I fail to see why we're frugal if we're, it seems to me, paying doubly for a maintenance plan.
The study that was commissioned from Pete Marwick looked at the building maintenance for all buildings in the town. We looked at the whole group, the 7 school buildings, 7 town buildings. The Pete Marwick study determined that we were underfunding our building maintenance and understaffing our building maintenance. Just one of the measures that I recall is that we ought to be able to clean 27,000 square feet of building area with a custodian, and we were in the 36,000 square foot area. What the money in FY 2001 is for, and in 2002, is to increase the expenditure on building maintenance in accordance with that study to implement the study. It's not more study money, it's implementation. It's more custodians, it's more maintenance people in the buildings, in the schools, in the town buildings to basically manage and maintain the significant investment that we have in those facilities. We've spent millions of dollars over the last 10 years on town buildings, on school buildings. I think you all hear and perhaps make the criticisms that we're not maintaining the buildings as we should be. This is an attempt to address that. Just to be clear also, it's an increase of $50,000 in building maintenance to implement that study in 2001, and it's a further increase in 2002. It's not $50,000 plus $100,000. $100,000 is cumulative. And that does not complete the implementation of that study, but it makes a very significant down payment on getting ourselves to where we need to be on building maintenance.
Thanks, Peter.
Hi, Harry Curtis. I live on Haverhill Street. I just offer my suggestion that you look at the consultants as well. I've had a lot of experience using them where I work, and usually the employees where I work are more insightful about how we can make things better than than the consultants. So I think that's definitely worth looking at. The other, I guess I have a question as it relates to, you look at the possible reductions in the budget on a line item basis, and it's small increments across 100 different items, but it all really does relate back to the cost of salary and benefits across the board for our town. So I think it's a mistake to look at it just as an cost of education or a cost of public works or something. I think it's really a factor of the overall economy that we're in, and the fact that the cost of hiring good people and maintaining those people in your system continues to go up every year, and you're competing, against other employers of choice who have a lot to offer. So I guess my question is, with what other companies are doing to keep their HR costs down is not so much to reduce the level of increases that they're giving folks from year to year, but to reduce through attrition by replacing manual functions with some sorts of technology innovation. I used to have a secretary a lot of years ago, and I had to learn how to type when they gave me a computer, and I know I don't look that old, but it's true. And so I guess my question is, when you look at things like the finance functions or administrative functions within the schools and whatever, is there an opportunity to take advantage of some basic technology to reduce expenses that way? Thank you.
I think the answer is yes, there is, and yes, we have, and we anticipate continuing to do that. If you look at page 7, and I'm going to focus on the municipal side, obviously, for a minute. You look at the staffing levels from FY 90 to FY 2000, and what you'll see and you just take any of the departments, but particularly the ones that tend to be more technology, tend to be able to use technology better, accounting, community development, finance particularly. And you look at the levels of personnel that we have, and you look at the kinds of things that we're doing now that we weren't doing 10 years ago, we are, in fact, much more efficient. We have, and I'd have to go through and do a mental head count in town hall just as an example, but I'd be willing to guess we have 5 less clerical employees now than we had 10 years ago. We use technology widely. There is an expense to using technology. You have to have somebody to manage the technology, and that's the major increase that's reflected in the finance department budget. But we do use it well. I have a very good office manager, administrative assistant secretary. She does an awful lot of work for me. I do an awful lot of work myself. Every one of our department heads has a computer on their desk. It's not a boat anchor. We actually use them. One of the problems that we have, frankly, is we don't have the money to keep the technology going as fast as we would like to be able to take it. One of the cuts we're talking about here is elimination of an initiative on the GIS system, Geographic Information System, that we'd like to have. In fact, it was ironic, you talk about the relationship between the town and the school. We're going to have to redistrict for a 5th elementary school. The assistant superintendent, associate superintendent called today and said, gee, can we get into your GIS system and do that through the computer? I said, we'd love to. We'll see in about 5 years when we have the GIS system. We're doing well in terms of technology. We'd like to do an awful lot more. But yes, I think we're using it very, very effectively.
Dave Lautman, Precinct 4. As I understand it, I just want to know if I have my figures correct. We spend way below the average per capita for the town. Is that correct?
That's correct.
We spend way below average for the average town for the school side. Is that correct, per pupil? I guess what I wonder is how we've gone so long without an override. The second thing is, in account to the person who's wondering about SBAB reimbursement, if we don't get the school, we got to buy the portables. Is that true? We have to house the students someplace. So we're going to be stuck with that expense no matter what. And I guess the third question for Peter is, I see a lot of public safety cuts. And I know that public safety isn't something that you can replaced with technology. You need cops on the road, you need plows on the road to keep, to sand the streets. And I guess, I'd like to know how these severe cuts, in my mind, and I think in anyone who looks at the figures, how they will affect our ability to keep the public safe.
It's a valid question, and you might suggest, as one of the speakers did earlier, we shouldn't be cutting in the public safety areas, and certainly we don't want to cut in the public safety areas. We had a consultant report, and I know some of you believe in consultants and some not, but a very effective consultant report looking at the police department and the staffing and deployment of our police department. It was the first study they ever did where they didn't recommend a reduction in the size of the police force. They actually recommended an increase. We put some of those positions in the budget over the last several years. Town of Reading, and I think we sort of take it for granted as a group of citizens, we have the lowest crime rate in suburban Boston. Look at the statistics, they're FBI statistics, they're accurate, they're commonly reported. If you look at any of the communities around us, we're 40, 50, 60% lower in terms of crime rate in this community. We have a very good, aggressive police department. If you reduce that by 1 or 2 people, we're obviously not going to be able to do the job that we can do now. Does that mean that our crime rate is going to balloon? I certainly hope not, and I can't tell you that that will happen. But we certainly will not be able to do the job that we're doing. If we have to lose a couple of firefighters, including assistant fire chief, we're not going to be able to do a lot of the proactive work that we do, the inspections and all of that sort of thing that we're able to do now. And will we be able to fight fires in town? Yes, we have mutual aid. We'll be able to do the best we can with that, but obviously we will not be able to do the job that we're able to do now. The fire chief makes a very compelling case. We've got to be adding 3 firefighters to the budget as opposed to reducing 2 and a top administrative position. The one I'm really most concerned about, honestly, and it's not anything against police and fire, but I'm really most concerned about the Public Works Department. If you look at what's happened in this town over the last 10 years, even though we haven't grown in total population as a community, look around you. We're adding streets. We're developing parks. We have, our public works function has grown 17% in the last 10 years, when the CPI has grown 28%. What does that tell you? It tells you that we're not doing anywhere near as much now as we have in the past. And this wasn't big ticket items that we cut out. I mean, we're still collecting your trash. We still have street lights. We still have all those kind of things. So what's happened over those years is we've had to, through attrition, reduce the size of the public works force. These are the people that plow your snow. These are the people that mow your park so your kids can play, your soccer, baseball, whatever they play. These are the people who repair the streets. These are the people who do all the grounds maintenance now around the schools. This is pretty essential stuff to maintaining the physical plan of the community. We've put a focus on building maintenance, and I think that's proper and appropriate. I hope as a community, if we have additional resources in the future, we're going to be able to go back and redo some of the public works things that we've had to reduce. We'll manage it and we'll survive it. I'm not giving you a doomsday speech here if we don't have this override. We'll manage and survive for a year, a couple of years, but you'll begin to see the impact, and it's going to be in very subtle ways. It's unfortunate, and you can't do anything about it. If we don't have the horses to do the work, then we can't get the work done.
Gail Phillips Spence, 222 Grove Street, Precinct 6. I just had a comment and then I have a question, and my comment is in regard to Birch Meadows kindergarten next year, and that's that a certain percentage of those kids, and I forget what the percent is, live beyond the 2-mile limit and are on the bus, whether they go to Coolidge or whether they go to Barrows. And certainly that's not all of them, but it is a certain percentage of them. And then my question is more, I have some neighbors, nice people that I've been talking to recently. They have a fixed income, and they also have had some unexpected, very high medical and prescription bills. And being on a fixed income, that's certainly a concern for them. It's not going to be ongoing, so it's something they're going to be able to come over. And I know I think there's some fuel assistance programs for people in that type of situation, but does Reading offer any type of assistance for people in that type of circumstance?
I think there are several things that we offer. One thing we offer right now is a senior tax worker program. It's for people over 60 years of age, and there are some means testing. There's some income limits on it. But basically, you can come in and work in a town office or for a town department. And you can work up to 100 hours, and you can work off $500 worth of your tax bill. And it's been very effective. It's been very helpful to the departments. I know we've used it in library, in parks, in my office. That's who processes the dog licenses every year when you relicense your dog. Very helpful to the departments, very helpful certainly to the people who are in that money. There is fuel assistance is available. It's a federal program. We actually do the intake locally in Reading, and it is means tested. In other words, you have to be lower moderate income, not just senior citizens, any age, and there is funding available for that. It's not a huge amount. One of the things that's really nice about this town is that a lot of you and your friends and your neighbors over the years have contributed to something called the Human Services Revolving Fund, which is administered by the town, but we don't put any money into it. We just do the paperwork on it. So that if people have a particular need, some of the kinds of things you talk about, we can help them out by basically using money that has been donated by residents of the community or businesses in the community to help out other people in the community. It's sort of our own little united way, I guess. We also have the trust funds. Funds were left to the town years and years ago to build a hospital. If you've looked around lately, we haven't built one. But the monies are available to help in certain situations, and there's means testing for that also. The two major uses are for transportation to and from medical appointments and for home care after a hospital stay. The trust fund's been modified to allow that. And so there are things that are available in the town through Beth Kleppeis's office for the trust funds and through our Human Services Department. And we do provide a lot of work. Oh yeah, that's the other one. Tax deferment is a program. If you want to get into it, we can. Beth can talk about it a little bit, but it's basically a program where, again, based on a certain income level and age, you can actually defer taxes to a future situation. It's basically until you move out of the house or the house is sold, and then those taxes become due with interest. But that is an effective program. We found in today's economy, frankly, not too many people use it. Back in the early 90s, we had actually quite a few people on it, and that is a program that's also available.
If I could just add one as well. Some folks came to me with an idea that apparently has been recently adopted in Winchester, where there's a form that goes out with the tax bill where taxpayers can make a voluntary payment to assist their neighbors that are on a fixed income. And it's actually seems to be working very well in Winchester. I believe over $12,000 has been raised in just a few short months. So I think that's something that the Board of Selectmen will be considering going forward. My understanding is it's used in Boston as well. So we're taking a look at that. Judge, did you have something to add?
Well, I was just going to say that the legislature has recognized that the property tax burden on fixed incomes is a problem too, and they're considering what they're calling a short circuit proposal, and where the tax will be capped for homeowners, in that condition, and they'll get a credit on their state tax. That's under evaluation now, and it seems to be getting pretty favorable reviews too. So there's a lot of things going on, a lot of initiatives going on in that area, a lot of existing programs as well.
Did I see a hand up in the back? Yes.
Hi, I'm Linda Phillips, and I'm in Precinct 6. I just found out in the last couple of elections. I'm new to the town, and I'm from a town that has open town meetings, so I have spoken in public before, but this is a little daunting, to say the least. A couple of questions I wanted for clarification, because I've been hearing the same things, and I'm not really sure if I'm understanding. When I'm hearing about special ed, are we talking about OT, occupational therapy, physical therapy, and speech therapy? And in some cases, are the 510 children who receive special ed, are those the children with the IEP, Individual Education Plan? Is that part of the special ed?
We have 3 categories of special education students in the Reading Public Schools. We have 582 students who receive what's referred to as part-time services. That ranges, and it is about an IEP. These are all students that have individual educational programs and a team meeting and parents and people. We have 582 students who receive everything from just monitoring to part-time services. We have 64 students in the Reading Public Schools who are what we refer to as substantially separate. More than half, closer to 3/4 to almost full-time. They are out of regular ed classrooms, and they are in special education, self-contained, substantially separate. And we have 64 of those students. So those are students who get up in the morning and go to Reading, one of our 7 schools, but they're primarily in a self-contained classroom with teachers and other students and ed assistants. We have 65 students who get up in the morning, get on a bus, and leave the town of Reading. Those are the students that we pay tuition for, and those range from generally, I don't think we have too many students below 25,000 and can go as high as 100,000. That doesn't include transportation, which generally will run anywhere from, I think we have some students, transportation's running about $5,000 or $6,000 to students that are at $20,000 per day. So if you have a student who's costing $100,000 a year for tuition and $20,000, then the town of Reading is paying $120,000 a year for their per pupil.
Are these private institutions? The state doesn't offer any facilities for these kind of children?
There are 2 kinds of places that students go to. One is referred to as public, and the public, we belong to 2 consortiums. We belong to the North Shore Consortium and the SEAM. These are superintendents from schools around us who have children with similar needs, maybe 1 or 2, and by putting a collaborative together, we are able to jointly have services. Reading High School, this building has 2 programs. It has a developmentally delayed program for middle school students and one for high school students, and that's a regional thing where children from North Reading, Linfield. We also send Reading children to Wakefield and to Winchester and to North Reading in a similar program. The second is private. Things like the Lab School, Landmark, and places like that. Now, just because you brought it up, I think it's important, and it goes back to something Bob. If a student comes to the Reading Public Schools after July 1st from another town and moves in, if the child comes from a private institution, Reading does not have to pick up that cost until the following year. If the student comes from a collaborative, similar to the SEAM, or similar to the North Shore, then Reading has to pick that up, and that's an unanticipated cost that we weren't expecting. In this year, there have been 13 unanticipated students joining the Reading Public Schools. 12 of them have come from public facilities. Those are 12 students who we had no idea would be in the Reading Public Schools when our budget was approved.
Thank you for answering that question. The other comment that I hear quite often is that I guess we're comparing ourselves to the state or other towns in the area, that we cost us $1,000 less. Believe it or not, most of the other towns in our area, and I've done a little survey, at least of the 7 or 8 towns that surround us, they bus, and busing is a large part of that $1,000 fee per child. So we should be paying less because we're doing all the busing, bringing our children to and from school 2 and 3 times, and sometimes 4 times a day. The other part of it is how much of the school building capital projects, are they included in the school budget or are they included in the town budget?
Can I go back to your second question? It is true that Reading comparatively does very little busing. But you also have to remember that we have about 4,200 students in the school system, and if you do it comparatively to other towns, you're talking about $200,000, maybe $300,000 difference in budget. Busing is probably anywhere from $200,000 to $300,000 in those communities. Reading eliminated busing by going to the state minimum, which is 2 miles. I don't think there's anyone who would argue that asking a 5-year-old kindergartner to travel 2 miles is pretty questionable. But that's what the state reimburses us. So I wanted to clear that up.
What do you mean, the state says that it's okay for children who are 5 years old to walk 2 miles to school?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the other thing I just wanted to bring up is the difference between the state average, and Dr. Harrington alluded to the cost of busing between a community maybe a few $100,000 more, and that's a significant amount of money. But as Mr. Toomey mentioned earlier, to reach the state averages, we would need an additional $3.7 to $4 million. That's a considerable amount of money that it would take for us to spend what the average per pupil spending is in the communities throughout the Commonwealth.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, the town manager does compare his services to the surrounding towns. The school department has not. We traditionally pay our, well, at least I'll speak to school administrators, anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000 less than the average school administrator in the Middlesex County. The school department has always compared our salaries to a collaborative of 9 towns, including Tewksbury, Shrewsbury, Franklin, and there's a series of towns, because we believe that teachers would travel a farther district. So when the school committee does comparisons on special ed, salaries and things like that, we've always used these 9 towns, which about 6 or 7 years ago we developed through the Department of Revenue using a lot of different indicators. You had a third question.
Well, I wanted to ask if the school building, the capital school building, is included in the school budget or the town budget.
There's a capital plan, and about 6.5% of the general budget is put aside for capital. And as the other gentleman asked earlier,
So school building plans for capital expansion, like new schools, are not included in the school budget.
that's correct.
So that makes the school budget look a little bit less,
Well,
obviously.
It's not in any of the communities.
Let me explain. At the end of every year, we file a report with the Department of Education. Things like the fact that we don't have a business manager and some other town and things like that are all taken into consideration. Transportation is taken out, by the way. Transportation is not one of the things that the state uses to develop the per pupil. The budgets are exactly comparable. We've tried very hard to go into other towns' budget and find out, do they do unanticipated? Every town does it differently. The only thing that we're guaranteed is the end of the year report, which is filed by all superintendents in June, has categories. And our town accountant and the town finance director breaks down our budget and puts that into the categories. That is the most accurate, and that is what the per pupil is based on across the state.
So the other towns do not also include the pensions and salaries for the teachers?
Again, all of that
In
is...
other words, that's included in our town budget, where in other towns, because I've read other towns' annual report, that is included in the school budget. And any capital plans for school building is included in the school budget. But we have it on the town, so it's like hard to get a real finger on what the school expenses actually are, because the town is still paying for them on the town side, and it's not being counted in the school budget side. And we're saying, it seems to me, that our numbers look really great, and we're patting ourselves in the back. And here we are talking about an override because the town doesn't have enough money in the budget to run a budget the way, I don't know, maybe you and I, or maybe you don't.
I
balance
think
your budget
what you
every
have
year.
to do is, as the superintendent was saying, you know, the things that you're talking about are things that are adjusted in those final state reports. They do adjust all the reports from all the superintendents and all the school systems, so they do compare apples and apples. So those final state spending numbers are very, very similar, identical in the categories that they count. So if there's an issue with a benefit being included, it's included from all the districts. Whether they start at separate points, the report brings them together or separates them depending on the state format. So busing is not included. It's not included for anybody, no matter where they put that in their budget. And that's the way it is. That's how those reports are broken down. So when we report a state average, it's a state average that is consistent across all the school districts. And it's not different for Reading, and it's not different for Linfield, and it's not different for North Reading. They are the same.
So the ones that we compare ourselves to, are they also looking for an override for their town budget?
Well, I I think some may be and some may not be, but again, I think if you look at Reading, there are a couple of things that are different about us that are different about many of our neighbors. One of the things is that we have done every capital project that has been done in the town over the last 14 years, I'll vouch for, but forever. We have not used a Prop 2.5 override to fund that. So, for example, and I'm not going to pick on anything particularly, but the police station project that we've just completed, the Parker Middle School project, the Coolidge project, have all been paid out of your general tax levy without an override, without going to the voters and saying, we need money for this project. If you look at, if you look at all the communities around us, if you look at North Reading, they did their high school with a Prop 2.5 override, they did the library with a Prop 2.5 override, they're proposing another override for an elementary school project. That's the way they're funding their capital projects. If you look in Stoneham, I think it's $30 million to redo all of their schools as a Prop 2.5 override. Linfield is considering going forward with a tens of million dollar Prop 2.5 override. That's the way a lot of communities fund their capital. The town of Reading has not. We asked once, we were turned down once. It was for a 2 elementary school project, and so we have funded it out of the budget. Had we not done that, if you look on page if you look on page 6, which is the history of expenditure in Reading from 1990 to 1999, and you'll see debt service line. And in 1990, we were spending $1.5 million on debt service. That's basically paying the bonds for the capital projects. And in 1999, we're spending $3.25 million. If we had done all the capital projects in that time frame that we bonded for, if we'd done those as the debt exclusion override, your budget this year would probably be, and the needed money would probably be about, what's that, $1.75 million less than what we're spending now. Well, that's just about what we need right now. So that's one of the major differences. The other major difference in Reading, and Carol Grimm mentioned it, if you look in North Reading, because the community is not fully developed and there's a lot of growth going on in that community, they're increasing their tax levy by about $1 million a year, over and above 2.5%. And they're doing it because new growth is exempted from 2.5% the first year that it's built. In Reading, that figure is $250,000 to $300,000. If you look at Reading, our property tax base is 91% single-family residential. It's about 9% commercial industrial. The only community around us that's worse than that is the town of Linfield. If you look at the average home value in Linfield compared to the average home value at Reading, it's significantly higher. So it's partly the makeup of our community. It's partly how we funded capital projects that lead us to the concern we have right now and the issue we have right now.
So the issue as far as you're concerned is because we fund capital different than other towns, we go to ask people for more money for our operating budget, which is different where other towns will say. In other words, we took the town money and we put it in a savings account called capital plan because we have building projects we want to do. So that leaves us on the lean side of what we need to operate every day. I mean, it's kind of like, yeah, I can save my money. I can put half of my salary and save it and say, well, I want to save that for a vacation. But if I'm not making my car payments, my mortgage or tax payments, well, I'm not really saving anything.
Well, in
so
a
to
sense,
say
though,
whether it's an override for one thing or the other, the bottom line is whatever way you look at it, you're asking for more money.
All communities operate on the lean side. Some communities, some of our neighbors, have gone out and asked for debt exclusion or capital exclusion overrides. In Reading, we asked for that once. It was not approved by the voters. I think it was in 91 or 92. And we've done our capital planning work to try to make sure that we can do that without going out for the overrides. But if you look at the numbers and you just do the math, if you have anything that's increasing at more than 2.5% per year, and 60% of your revenue is only increasing at 2.5% per year, it doesn't work forever. And that's part of Prop 2.5.
We as superintendents sit down a lot and talk about these kind of things in our district, and I just want to give you a real good example. In a manner I think that I understand, I hope you will. My colleague in North Reading will see over $1 million growth this year, and he has 2,500 kids. That's $1 million that's going to be added to the tax levy that comes just because the economy is great. He got cut Chapter 70 almost at the same level we did, but he could absorb it because the small amount that he got caught back on Chapter 70, their dependent on state aid is much lower than Reading. We have 4,200 kids. Our new growth is less than 300,000. It's between 250 and 300,000. That is 750,000, or a third to 750,000 less in the neighboring town, and we have twice as many students. So even if you take out all the capital and everything else, just new growth. The problem we're running into is a town like Reading is kind of unique, where most of the towns in Massachusetts are seeing, great growth. Many towns, my colleagues are saying, Harry, what's the big deal? You must be, putting new businesses up, new employees, signs of help wanted. We don't have that because of the high level of residential.
I just wanted to ask, what was the amount that was put in the capital budget this year for the new school?
The new school for FY 2001 is I think $42,000 is what Carol indicated. Because of the way projects are constructed and funded, you don't get all the money up front and start paying the bonds right away. You actually pay 5 years of $37,000. You actually pay 5 years of temporary borrowing notes, and then you pay the full, the beginning of the bonds. And of course, what happens with the bonds are 2/3 of those are reimbursed by the state.
How long have we planned the bonds for the new school? To pay the bonds before the state reimburses us? Because the state is saying 5 to 8
5 years. 5 years is what we use, as the superintendent indicated. The Parker project came in 4 years. I think the elementaries, were they full 5 years, Beth? They may have been. Coolidge is going to be 4 to 5 years. So we try to be a little bit on the conservative side.
One of the comments I'd like to make, though, is the town of Reading has prepared its budget. I believe, and I think the people on the committees of this town believe that it's a more honest approach to budgeting. It includes 6% plus or minus a couple tenths for capital. We try to include in the budget annually all those things that the town needs to operate, to provide the services, to provide for education, and to provide for the capital growth that's required. One of the pieces of capital equipment that we look at in the next budget is a fire truck. Some towns will go for overrides to buy those fire trucks. Well, in a sense, they need to buy that piece of equipment anyway. And by putting these things in our budget, by facing our budget head on with all the things that we need to operate the town in a manner that the citizens have come to expect and really do expect, it's a forthright, honest approach. And it says that if we can provide, and I compare it more to a mortgage, we can pay our mortgage, which is we put 1% of our money into capital every year, and it's not a major percent, it's about 6%, it should be about 6.5%, that we can afford to do these things that as a town we think we need to do. And these include building new schools, providing fire trucks, providing DPW equipment. And I just think that Reading is very unique in this approach, that we're telling people with our plan that this is how you want to run the town, and this is what it will cost. And we're not going to come back and say, by the way, geez, we really need that fire truck, because it's in the plan, and there's a piece of equipment rotated every 4 years, or the 5 years, 5 years, that shows that we will be replacing this equipment on schedule. And just like Peter mentioned with the police cars, which actually happen to be in the regular budget, that we will be replacing these every year because this is what it costs to run a town. So we're not going to come at you like another town that says, by the way, geez, we have an enrollment issue, let's throw an override and hope we can solve it. We're telling the town up front what we think it takes to solve the problems. And we go out and ask. And I have to quote Tom Stallman, who said, Proposition 2.5 was not meant to be punitive. It was meant as a mechanism to go and ask the population, whether they would be willing to fund these things, whether they would be willing to do these things as a town. And he was always asking us why we don't go and ask. Well, we're going and asking now because as a town, as several town bodies, we think that the prudent way to run a town is to do these things that are included in the budget. It's prudent, it's educationally sound, it's fiscally prudent, and one of the things that will happen is we have to do these things anyway in the future. So why sit here and put it off? Why build portable classrooms? Why put off maintenance? Why put the fire truck off when it compromises public safety? So we're coming to the population saying, we have a problem with revenue shortfall. We want to continue to run this town in what we think is a prudent manner. And that's why we're asking the population for this override. Nothing more, nothing less, an honest, forthright approach.
Well, I appreciate your comments, but on the other hand, I am self-employed. I cannot guarantee that my income will increase 2.5% every year. So I have to budget lowball, which means if I make 2.5% more, that might be a family vacation that we couldn't otherwise afford. And I know in my business, I've had to budget for long-term capital expenses like new trucks and equipment also. And my 5-year plan went down the tubes when I looked, and I had no money in my capital fund and no personal savings, and I had to forego that for another 4 years. And I think sometimes our expectations about what we want is not in line with what we really need. And some of us really say, if we have to do that in our home budget, we really feel that the town should be taking a closer look and scrutiny of where the overhead is, where the excesses are. And I mean, this is the first attempt at a public forum, and I got the notice through my children at school. What if it was made to for a public notice for other people to come? I heard it was on television. So who paid for those flyers that went in every school kid's backpack today to make sure that parents of children were here to support, more spending? And thank you.
Just so we can clarify, we put together a flyer to go home. We sent it to the chief counsel for the Office of Campaign and Finance. We asked for a legal review, and the Office of Campaign and Finance said that giving people notice of a meeting where it does not indicate whether it's for or con, you can use public funds to bring that notification about.
And only send it to a few public people that you're trying to target as a marketing area. I resent my child coming home from school with a flyer paid for by the town to advocate for more spending on the town's behalf. I don't think that's a prudent way to spend my money.
The request was a notification of a time and a place with no mention of being for or against the override.
I haven't heard any person on the board talk about being fiscally austere the way the rest of us have to be in our lives. And to be perfectly honest with you, Mr. Toomey has signed a flyer that I've received going around town supporting the override, and I don't think anyone here has personally addressed him this evening, but yet he's had a free forum to speak about his support for the override, and I think that's a very dangerous, precarious political position to put yourself into. Yes, if someone asks you, I think the man who was here from Campaign Finance said that. So I'm offended because he's had the microphone and the time that other people who are not for this don't have. And I don't think that that's right.
If I could just make a couple of points. The Board of Selectmen have had countless open public meetings on the budget issue, both as a Board of Selectmen and in the joint meetings with the school committee and the finance committee. I think there's been at least 12 to 15 meetings, all combined. The agenda is posted, it's public, we've discussed it, we've invited phone calls. I myself have also signed what you said that Mr. Toomey has signed. In addition, the Board of Selectmen took a vote, the Finance Committee took a vote, the School Committee took a vote. This was all done in public with public input at each and every step of the way. Now, I don't think any of us can divorce ourselves from the proceedings. I believe out of the 3 boards, there was 1 abstention and 1 negative vote for the override after full and fair discussion. I certainly understand your concern. I've said this before. I've always considered myself a fiscal conservative. I believe it is a close budget. I believe it is an austere budget. I've looked at the numbers. There's not a lot of places to cut. This is not like the federal government where there's $100,000 to study the mating of seagulls on the Pacific coast. This is police, it's fire, it's schools. That's why I voted to support it at the beginning. That's why I continue to support it. I think the notice about a public forum, frankly, is helpful so that people can come and give their views. I think we've recognized anybody and everybody that wants to speak, that wants to ask a question, that wants to make a comment. We've not only done that tonight, we've done that at countless other public meetings that have been posted. So I certainly appreciate your concern when we come and ask for money, but I do take a little bit of umbrage at the fact that you think that somehow we're not concerned with citizen input. We've begged people to come and talk to us.
I said I don't want my children to be used as messengers of proponents of certain things, because I would like to take it at my own expense and have that same audience and send home with every single child that I wanted to pay, but that would be illegal.
Okay. Do you have a question?
John Carpenter, Hanscom Ave, Precinct 7. I just wanted to respond to the previous speaker's concern about lack of information. I've attended budget forums since September. I have seen the issue of the need for schools and the need for additional money hotly debated in both town papers. I would invite the previous speaker to subscribe to the paper that requires subscription and to read the one that comes into her mailbox for free. The issues of overhead and necessity and priorities have been debated by volunteers in this town and paid staff endlessly, and you'll see it again at town meeting. There is plenty of information in this town if you simply open the paper or go to a meeting and avail yourself of that available information. There are people here tonight who are on both sides of this issue. You heard some applause about a previous speaker who was not in favor of the override. Some of these people have been involved in town politics for 30, 40, 50 years. The information is here. There are ways to get it. And those of us who take the time to inform ourselves and participate in the debate, please give us credit for doing that. Please take the time to join us in doing that. That's how democracy works. Thank you.
I can also say the Finance Committee has met the last 4 Wednesday nights in a row, and every department head in the town has trooped through and presented their budget to us. They have all been public meetings. We've sat through a night and gone through the school budget where we submitted over 60 questions to be answered, and they were all answered. I can tell you on the municipal side of the budget, there's a little over 4% for salary increases. There's only about 1.5% on the expense side. They're trying to hold expenses next year at the same level this year, and I'm honestly concerned whether we can actually live with that. We might be actually under budgeting ourselves at this point. So we urge you to come. FinCom is meeting the next 4 Wednesday nights. We are posted for the remainder of the month every Wednesday night. Next Wednesday night, in fact, we are doing a full review of the capital budget and the financing plan associated with that. So come join us at Town Hall.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm Steve Frechette, Rustic Lane, I think it's Precinct 1. We've had a lot of discussion about particulars with how to reduce the budget and whether or not we need the override. If we talk a little bit about what we can do or what plans have been in place to increase the amount of commercial revenue we can get from the town.
I think just briefly, because I think we've touched on it a little bit, obviously the landfill and working with the second bidder, the development of Addison Wesley, the downtown steering committee is obviously interested in not only improving the looks of it, but also making sure that we have full tenants. Peter, do you want to add anything to that? I mean, those are kind of the big ticket items. Addison Wesley, I did mention Addison Wesley. Which Addison Wesley, by the way, I think the figure is if we can develop that, 1.5 million a year.
$1.5 million increase from what it's generating now in taxes.
Okay.
But there's nothing further longer term than that.
There's not a whole lot of room left in town. I think that's, part of the issue is there's not a lot of new growth. Yes, sir.
Harry Curtis, Haverhill Street. As it relates to the accounting practices, it seems to me it would be easier for you folks who, I resent the fact that anyone accuses you folks of being a bunch of hacks, because I think you're nuts. When I turn on the TV...
So does my wife.
at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and you folks are debating this stuff, and you know there's no one else in the room but the people that the camera's on. So I applaud you all for doing a great job. And I think you expose yourself to a lot of abuse in these forums with pretty good humor. And as it relates to the accounting practices, I think you tend to make it harder on yourselves. I thought that Harry made it pretty hard on himself in comparing the cost of the new school versus putting kids in portables and the alternate cost of staffing the school. I think, and I looked at those numbers pretty closely, and I bet there's no difference at the end of the day when you look at propping up the portables and doing all the stuff that you have to do there. As it relates to the cost of financing these capital programs, it seems like you could probably fund the capital plan at 1 or 2%, pay for the pickup trucks and the snowplows out of that, and not have to come for an operating override and come to the taxpayers every time you wanted a fire station, a police station, and a new school either built or renovated. And those are choices that you make, and either way, it seems to me you'd have a much easier time maintaining your operating plan, under that scenario. And then we'd be asking the town to come out and vote every time if we wanted to do any kind of capital expenditure. So I think it's a reasonable way to do it.
Thank you. Bob?
Bob Lurloff, Sheriff, Precinct 4, County Road. I'm the only person here tonight who did not vote for the override. Matt is not here. I abstained. Just to make it perfectly clear, the reason I abstained is because I am very conservative fiscally, except in the purchase of toys. The real reason I abstained was not because I thought we shouldn't have the override, but because we had had one formal night of looking at the budgets. We've now had 4 formal nights. There is no waste in this town. There's waste in everything you do. I could find $1,000 this town wastes. It's very small. There's no question that the override is needed. And, were we to take a formal vote, there's no question the Finance Committee is now unanimous that absolutely this is essential for the town to keep running. I just wanted to make that clear, where I was one of the persons that was perhaps skeptical, and why I was skeptical. I'm not skeptical anymore.
It's now past 10 o'clock. I'm sure we will take any other questions if there are any. Oh, sure.
Gary Phillips, Precinct 6. I just don't want to major on minors here this evening. As a relatively new resident of Reading, I really appreciate the service you render, I'm sure without fair compensation for the town.
What's compensation?
It's something you pay to others, I guess, in your position. However, I do agree with my wife, who was a controversial speaker here a minute ago, about the use of children to disseminate information. I feel that the thing that's important there is that people like the elderly, people who are in the margins or whatever, are at a disadvantage when they happen not to be the parents of school-age children. I just don't think that's fair, and I don't think that's a fair use of any school budget money whatsoever. I just think it's wrong. And go ahead.
Can I just ask you one question?
Yes.
Because we've advertised in a number of different ways about both the financial forums, which have met since September,
no objection,
the Finance Committee, the Board of Selectmen, and would you have been here tonight without that information provided?
Yes, I would have. So why the need to...
Well, no, I'm just wondering, what are the sources you've gotten it from?
The point then becomes, why the need to go ahead and appropriate a minuscule amount of school money in the use of the children to inform a targeted sector of the
Because
population.
I think we went ahead and did it because we were so highly unsuccessful through other advertising mediums at bringing people out. As I said, we've had dozens of meetings, and I can count on one hand. I think Bill Brown was there, Jerry McDonald was there, Gail's been there. That's about it. And we need more citizen input, not less. So I understand, believe me, I understand the philosophical point. But on the other hand, the practical point is we need to get results. You can't have us up here operating in a vacuum. And to some extent, that's happened. Because we put it in the paper, we put it on Channel 9, we put it on whatever, Channel 22, and nobody shows up. So I understand your philosophical point. But on the flip side, at least we have a crowd tonight. And I think that's good for us to hear from people. So,
And don't make the assumption that everybody that has children in the schools is pro-override. I would suggest tonight that there are plenty of people that have serious concerns about the override who do have children in schools, and they want to come out and hear what's going on. And this is a way to solicit members from the broad community. You know, you advertise in the paper, you post it, you let the people that have children in the schools understand that there's a meeting. There was no indication pro or con, but it is about getting people to come out and give input and become informed.
Superintendent library too. Right. Again, hence the need not to send out the flyer, from my perspective. Using the school children. I don't like the taste of it. I think it was wrong. I thought it was unnecessary.
Well, we certainly appreciate your comments, sir.
All right. That's what it's for. We need not always agree. In the recommendations for budget reduction, I'm going back in my mind to a question asked earlier by one of the parents about the quality of school life and education should the override fail. My question is more philosophical, but I think more weighty in many respects. Could we consider, instead of a simple recommendation in budget reductions, changes in methodology where teaching are concerned, to go ahead and make teaching more effective, and by being more effective, thereby becoming more cost effective? I'd give you like a few examples that came to me as the evening progressed. We talk about language and this foreign language in the 6th grade. They were talking added funding. I don't see the need as a parent. This is just one individual parent's point of view. I think it's something that could be deleted, save money there. When you talk about a child being injured and at risk health-wise, and there not being adequate nursing, I'd much rather, as a parent, see a nurse in every school facility rather than a school resident psychologist. We're relatively new to town, we're getting acquainted, and I expect and hope you'll see and hear more of us as we get more involved in school issues. We have 2 elementary age children, as you probably have gathered by this point in time. I'd rather see more volunteerism. Again, I'd rather go ahead and see a teacher and a counselor used instead of a school psychologist. I don't see the need for things such as that. When it comes to methods of teaching, I'm able to sit down for a few hours with my child who is average to maybe a little slower than average when it comes to math skills. And I'm able, in every session with my child, to teach her the fundamentals of math calculation. She comes home with the Chicago math that I'm sure you've heard. I'm sure you've heard the song before, and she is at a loss to understand what's going on. But Dad, who has only a couple of years of college, is able to sit down in a short period of time, able to instruct my child adequately in mathematics. Maybe we're not being as efficient as we can. Maybe our methodology has to be changed. Maybe the academics are where we can do a whole lot to save financially. I'm just hoping that might cause there to be a little attempt at maybe a different approach than we have been using.
Mr. Phillips, I appreciate all your comments, and I would offer to you what the chairman of the school committee and I offered to your wife Monday night. Please make an appointment with me. You're new to town. I would very much be interested in the ability to sit with you and talk about these things. I should tell you that everything you said about making our people, helping our people become more efficient is very important. Unfortunately, one of the largest cuts we've made in the budget is professional development.
The other thing is, I mean, some of the things that you're talking about certainly are individual choices. I mean, you say, for instance, you think you could get rid of the foreign language. Now, the state is telling us that there's going to be a requirement for foreign language, and that they're going to have to pass a requirement for foreign language but before they can get a high school diploma. And it seems to me that what we know is that children learn better languages at an earlier age. Now, I don't know, if they talked about testing in the lower levels in the high school in the future for the MCAS?
The state is being wonderfully vague about exactly what's going to happen when. They keep telling us it's going to happen, but exactly when we don't know. This next year we understand that instead of having all testing done at only grades 4, 8, and 10, they will spread it out a little bit more. Same testing, but over a wider number of grades. You know, we're doing the best we can to make sure that we're ready when the requirement hits us, because as the state usually does, they will tell us, you know, in 2 years we were going to start testing in foreign language, let's say. We won't be ready in 2 years.
It hits a lot of us as strange that here we are struggling to perform better on the, I can never say the test correctly.
MCAS, MCAS.
We're not doing as well as we might hope as far as the verbal part of the test. And yet, we're doing what we can to instruct the children in a foreign language when they're having trouble in comprehension and the like in their own. And I don't know, I'll close. I don't want to over...
But we are moving ahead with curriculum initiatives in the current budget that are aimed at those language requirements. So there still will remain in the budget almost $200,000 that are dedicated to the materials in the elementary school and in some of the upper grades towards bringing in new curriculum materials for the language arts, so that we can, you know, bring a program in that's more targeted towards the curriculum frameworks of the Commonwealth, so that our students will be able to have the materials that will allow them to do better. So the foreign language initiatives are very minor compared to the initiatives that we're putting forth for language arts.
Okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Mr. Phillips, I think that your efforts with your child are certainly laudable, but if you were trained in Chicago math and you sat down one-on-one and tried to, you know, convey the principles of Chicago math, you'd probably be equally successful. And if we spent more on education so that there could be a better ratio of teachers to students, it would probably be more effective as well.
But she did grasp the basic calculations of math in that short period of time when she wasn't getting the math school.
One-on-one.
At that time. One-on-one Chicago math didn't do it. I mean, as a member of a class, it didn't do it. Right. And this was not after a short period of time. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Gail?
Just wanted to bring this up because it's come up several times, and the previous speaker just brought it up. I think people aren't really clear on what the role of the school psychologist is, and I didn't know if somebody from the school committee would like to address that. What function does a school psychologist serve?
School psychologist is a guidance counselor in the elementary schools and middle schools. In Massachusetts, there's 3 categories, and they're very much the same. There's an adjustment counselor, a guidance counselor, and a school psychologist. All basically perform the same function, only at different levels. And quite frankly, because of the use of school psychologists in the school system, we've been able to save quite a bit of money in our special ed budget because we don't have to contract that service out. So we're paying the same cost because of the teacher's salary scale for a guidance counselor or an adjustment counselor as we would a school psychologist.
One quick question. Requires only yes or no.
This is Harry we're talking about. It's not going to be yes or no. Go ahead.
Space available in this building, and I'm wondering if during all of this process consideration was given to bring in the class in the junior high that's coming up in next year, bringing them up in advance to accelerate each shuffling the classes to make the use of the available space in this building.
For the large audience that is at home, I'll repeat the question. Space utilization, is there extra space at the high school, and has there been consideration given to moving the 8th grade up to the high school in order to create more space in the grades below? Answer is yes. Okay, I hope we've, it wasn't going to be just yes, was it?
But one of the issues with moving a class up is that with enrollment issues over the next 8 years, you're going to have classes that the student population that this building will start to approach 1,500 plus students. And if you move that class up, now you have a high school that approaches, well, that was a long time ago, before you had computers, before you had special ed, before you had a lot of needs that are now included in this building. So the building and the educational requirements have changed dramatically since 1971. Yes, the space here is being used in a variety of manners consistent with high school education. I can put it that way. I mean, yes, there are teaching stations which are called classrooms that are given up to computer labs. I mean, if you didn't think a computer lab was important, yes, you could get rid of all your technology. We tend to think that it's important to have those types of facilities at the high school. But in the future, I mean, if you were to put 2,000 students in here, you wouldn't have room for anything anymore. So the architects tell us the school is rated for about just under 1,300 students. We expect that you will have a lot more than that in the next 8 years. To move the 8th grade up would be a short-term approach. You'd have to move it back down at some point and build those buildings and repair them anyway.
Well, I hope we've been able to answer everybody's questions. A couple of things. There are going to be 2 ballots on March 7th. One is going to be the presidential primary ballot, and one is going to be the town ballot. So when you go out to vote, make sure you know that it's 2 separate ballots, and please take both ballots. I do want to thank everybody for coming and for listening. I think it's great that we've had a lot of citizen input tonight, and I'm glad that everybody stuck with us through this late hour. And finally, with one last plea, if everybody could, whether you agree with the override or against the override, please just go out and vote on March 7th. It would be great to have a high turnout and a lot of interest in it. So thank you all very much, and good night. Is there a motion to adjourn on Board of Selection? Camille, motion to adjourn? Discussion?
You want school meeting?